Let's have a rapturous round of applause for our first speaker, Pete Crocker.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. All right, give me a second here to get all plugged in. All right, since this is a network automation event, first bit I want to start off with is... projector went off. All right, while I'm waiting for that. Hi everyone, Pete Crocker. I am very God knows long time network engineer. My career has been back and forth between being an engineer and working for vendors that make cool tools that I wanted in my day job. So I'm back over to the vendor side of the fence here, but what I'm going to talk about here today actually was one of my most recent day jobs here where I was doing network automation here full time. But in the spirit of NetDevOps days, if I can figure out which way this goes, my slides are code. So this is, if you haven't come across it, this is a tool called MARP, M-A-R-P. Takes a markdown file, makes a PDF, PowerPoint from it, right? So my slides are in a GitLab repo. I'll make sure I can post the link. And now, if I can find out where my mouse is. All right, so I'm going to storytell here a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons that I've learned here along the way of doing network automation. And these are not going to be like the typical code-based lessons to be learned from this. This is actually what's all the messy stuff around actually trying to succeed at network automation inside your organization, your company, something like that. Before we do that, let's go ahead and jump into a few basic things here. I want to figure out who's here in the room. So first off, by way of show and raise of hands, who's a network engineer in this room? All right, good. That's most of us. Who'd actually classify themselves as a developer? Not bad. Okay, interesting. All right, and so by way of either 0 hands raised, 1 hand raised, or 2 hands raised, how would you say how much network automation are you doing right now? Nice, okay. Good, that gives a bit of an understanding on this. All right, now, are you doing this, raise your hand if you're doing this more as a grassroots effort as opposed to a company-sponsored, supported effort. All right, and let's go to the other side of this. How many of you actually have management buy-in and are giving you what you need? That's fantastic. God, this is changing. Okay, now keep your hands up if you have that, right? How many of you, so put your hands back up if you're saying you've got management buy-in for doing automation. Now, bring your hand down if that actually is, that really isn't true. Like, are you still doing firefighting? Are you still basically having to beg and steal for time to be able to do network automation? Right? That's fantastic. So about half the room, I'd say. And then last one is, let's just figure out here, you can either raise your hands for one or both or any of these, right? How many of you would say you're doing artisanal coding for your network automation? Versus using frameworks like Ansible, Puppet, Chef, Salt, NSO, anything like that. Okay, and then how many of you are using commercial tools to fill in gaps on any of this?
ServiceNow does count, right?
Sorry?
ServiceNow counts, right?
Oh God, no. All right, that's great. So that's who we've got here in the room. So I'll jump into a few bits here. As I said, I'm going to give you a little bit of a story here about one of my last day jobs. My background is for funsies, right? You could say that I started doing scripting back, if anybody know what that is, Sun Spark 20, right? Before people took Linux seriously, you had Solaris, and so this wasn't Bash shell scripting, right? Because the Bash shell didn't even exist back then, right? This was Bourne shell scripting, right? I've been a network engineer since the mid-90s, and like I said, I've been back and forth between being an engineer and being in vendor land as well. But enough about me, let's go ahead and talk about my last day job here, right? So 2020, I was hired as a network automation engineer, actually as the job title, right? Mostly focused on doing actual network automation as a full-time job. I walked into a team that was doing as many of you probably are used to, right? This is tiny bit of scripting going on, no bit really any kind of automation at all. Everything was basically in Google Sheets, Google Docs, right? So it's a step up from Excel, I guess you could say, from that standpoint. But it was draw IO, network diagrams. None of that was accurate at all, right? And they wanted to try and start moving towards automation because they were spending their life firefighting. And so I was brought on board the team, and one of the biggest things I was trying to do was enablement of those around me, trying to help them understand what network automation was, why it's valuable, all of that. But the team never had the time to take any of this on board. There was never really an interest from some of the people to actually engage in any of this. They didn't understand what the value was. And the worst bit was that there was no management backing really at all, right? I was hired. They made it that far in understanding that they wanted automation, but not the day-to-day support and the making of space that was necessary actually to really have a team succeed and try and start stepping down that journey. So the first lesson that I learned on this one, right, is speaking the language of who you're actually talking to, right? I'd thought that I could help translate the message of why automation is valuable. I'd helped a number of companies through that journey of explaining the value, of getting management buy-in, all of that. But I didn't do it on my day job. And so trying to understand what was the motivations of the management, how they saw the world, that was the biggest gap I learned on that, is trying to actually sell to them, speak their language, understand what the value was, so that they would actually carve out the time and space necessary to be able to do this. It's really easy to forget, right, everything you've learned about automation, then to try and translate that to a new audience, to someone that's never been in that world before, right? You forget the gap of learning that you have from that standpoint, and so you've really got to go back and frame it in something that they understand. And the world that I lived in, right, their view of network automation is, right, a chatbot. Plug in something that's going to give me a little bit of data about my network, right? I want to run a Slack command that's going to end up telling me about the VLANs on a device, right? What was my view? That was going from the other complete extreme side of this, right, of like, we're going to have CI pipelines that are going to do constant validation and checking to make sure that nobody's done command line changes that have overridden all of this magic automation, right? So I was at this other level, and I'm dealing with people who are doing firefighting and Excel spreadsheets, right? And so trying to actually go and bring that gap together was my first failure there. And this goes to what was their value. They valued basically making a change as quickly as possible, being as responsive to the business as possible was priority number one. Just turn up the VLAN. I don't care about your scripts. I don't care about anything else. Just let the server and apps guys get on with getting their job done because it was on a project list and you have to hit a date. Don't ever allow for how do we do this faster or better next time? How do we try and reduce the troubleshooting and firefighting? Everything was troubleshooting and firefighting, and they were fine with that. And that probably was one of the biggest challenges on that. So you've got to essentially start with why on these things, right? Why is automation important? And make sure you've got buy-in from the people around you, especially the management around in the company. And the plan there, right? It's not just about automation. It's building up the team skills. It's trying to actually show wins along the way, metrics, timelines, all of that. You've got to incrementally show that value to management. Otherwise, you end up losing their buy-in on these types of big change projects. And frankly, aligning with business objectives, right? That's one of the easiest ways to go about this, right? The messy world of, what are the business goals and objectives? What are the big projects, right? You get alignment on those things, then you get a much smoother ride along the way. All right, so let's move on to number 2 here, which is the metaphorical hit by a bus example that we all talk about here, right? Many of you have probably worked in places where the network engineer that created the network, they were the documentation for the network. The network documentation was in their brain, and they're gone now, right? And there's no more documentation. So, the hit by a bus example here actually has some meaning at my last employer. And so let's talk about another little story here. I was doing a Greenfield data center deployment. It was day 1. All I needed to do was wake up in the morning, wait for the DC guys to go and finish doing all the cabling and everything, turn on all the switches, and then I was going to just run my nice, happy Ansible playbook, and everything was going to be up within minutes. As I dropped my kids off, I was cycling home and came around a bend. A car came around the other way. It was a bit of a rainy day. If there's any Dutch people here in the room, I have a bakfiets, right, which is basically the lorry of bicycles with a big old box on the front of it for my kids to sit inside of it, and slid on out. And the ambulance had to scrape me off the pavement. I'd gone and broken my hip. I was completely delirious and spent the next few days in hospital recovering. And so that was the morning they were expecting me to log into the web conference to run the Ansible playbook. So the first lesson, right? Git commit, git push. Right? I hadn't actually done that. Everything was still local on my laptop, and I'd not actually uploaded the code so that somebody else could actually do this. But more importantly from this, I was the only person that really knew how and what to do. I hadn't properly actually documented what I was going to do from that standpoint. They were solely reliant upon me to run an Ansible playbook, right? I could have actually shared the knowledge in 5 minutes about how somebody else could have done this. Assuming all went well and they didn't have to troubleshoot my code and all of that, then somebody else could have just ran the Ansible playbook and turned everything up. But because I didn't actually do a git commit, git push, and I'd not actually properly documented what my plan was to do that data center turnup, they had to reconstruct the entire configs by hand. Right? You had an on-site staff who had to be there for a limited window of time, so they had to scramble and try and create all the configs. And instantly right there, I'd lost the battle. They just made up VLAN IDs to get the job done. And then, because I was working in a business that valued firefighting, they'd never let me go and change those VLAN IDs in the future to try and create consistency. One of the things I was trying to do was take all of our different data centers across the world and make it so that it was just VLAN 10s for this use, VLAN 20s for that use. Makes it easy because we were hiring more junior ops people to try and support and troubleshoot the network. So if I can make it really easy for them, that every one of our DCs looks the exact same, then great. We're working towards things that are going to actually help out with firefighting and troubleshooting. But my company valued uptime versus config consistency to actually solve some of the more root problems that were going on. All right, so I'd learned my lessons from that standpoint, and I had actually done another Greenfield data center deployment, and day 2 of that data center deployment, I had one of the other network engineers log in and instantly add configuration manually. In this case, if anybody's used Cumulus Networks or FRR, the person had added a VRF on that box called default, right? So normally you're talking about like the global VRF, the default VRF, something like that. But the person had actually left off the T on the end of default, right? And created a new VRF on the box. And then, of course, ended up doing all the policy and routes and everything associated with that new VRF called default, and then wondering, of course, why the network's not working. And so all of that automation, all that beautiful, nice, pristine configuration, all the goals of that were out the window instantly. However, I did actually move on to another project where there was a different audience of who the automation was targeted towards. There was a different business needs around this, and hence, of course, there was a completely different take-up of success from this, right? And that moves me on to my third lesson here, right, which is know your limits. So it took me months and months to write and iterate away on effectively what was a 3,000-line Python application. And that application was essentially like building up, I can talk a little bit about here later, but I'm not a developer. I'm never going to be. I danced around this for so long, but I'm not a real developer. I'm a network engineer by background, by mentality, all of that type of stuff. I could have brought in a real developer and done this job in 2 weeks, what probably took me like 3 or 4 months to do. And they would have done a much better job at actually having good code, good test coverage, supportability, documentation, all of those types of things that a real developer does, right? So it's more than just can you do it, right? There's an element here of should you be doing it with your organization? What's the best use of your company's resources? Some people take the approach of you're learning automation here, you're learning how to become a developer. Other places it may be better to pair up a network engineer with someone who's a full-time Python or whatever language developer, and you get much better results out of that, right? So just remember there's alternative approaches here, and you can go and sell your company sometimes on what is the best way to go about doing this. The other bit I'd mentioned on this, the other lesson I would say is test your code, right? And what I'm saying by this is there are great environments to be able to spin up simulations and test these things on. In my previous life, like with Cumulus specific things, for example, they make the VMs freely available. It's really easy to spin up environments and test your automation code, right? Test failure scenarios, test the topology, test that everything basically works smoothly or that error reporting and everything works. My favorite tool at the minute, by the way, plug for, if any of you guys know Yvonne Peplinajak, IP Space, his NetLab project, right? It's a great environment for doing networks as code, essentially from a simulation standpoint. So there's my quick plug for NetLab. All right, rounding this out, let's go ahead and talk about a few bits of the cool techie stuff here from some of these projects that I worked on. First, I got to build a lovely Greenfield data center that is near Cambridge. It's technically one of the fastest supercomputers because marketing people loves to go and try and figure out how they can manipulate how you define a supercomputer in the UK and how fast it is and all that stuff, right? It was about a 35 million pound build, packed full with essentially GPUs for doing AI and everything. But the cool bit about it was that entire data center was built with a 35 quid Raspberry Pi. Each one of those boxes below it are about $200,000 each worth of GPUs and everything, and a data center full of those boxes. But at the end, basically it was a nice Raspberry Pi that acted as my DHCP server and also ran all my Ansible playbooks to do deployment from day one. All right, next bit of this. Why Ansible, right? I'm sure we're going to have fun conversations here, right, on whether or not I should be doing, what languages, what frameworks, all that type of stuff, right? The number one point I'll make on this one, right, is, again, this goes to business needs, right? I get why people do the natural curve of going from Ansible and then realizing that Ansible really sucks to do some things. And I just need to bypass it altogether and do Python anyways, right? So why don't I just bypass Ansible in the first place and go to Python? What it came down to for us basically was maintainability. We were actually doing full stack automation. This was spinning up the servers, spinning up the VMs, spinning up the applications. And so because it was an integrated approach across all of that, we needed to understand what each of the other teams' code did, and that was so much easier to do if we used Ansible as the common language back and forth between the teams. So think about who's going to maintain the code from that standpoint. Can someone else step into your shoes? Can they instantly make sense of what you're doing? And Ansible is good from that standpoint. The other bit I'll mention is docs as code. When you've got automation there, one of the things that you can easily use that for, right, is just self-document the network. In this case, one of the best things that I did was I kicked out cable mappings for the on-prem DC team in exactly the format that they wanted it in, how they thought about it. But it also kicked out all of the documentation there about what was the state of the network, how was it actually working. And so don't just stop at push the configs out. It's really easy also to essentially go and create a lot of documentation there along the way. One of the other cool things from this, by the way, is there's some open source tools out there where you can do things like LLDP validation, right? So plug in all the cables and then turn on all the switches, get all the switches configured. You can easily look at the LLDP output on devices and compare that with physical cabling and end up figuring out, did the on-prem team actually plug in everything properly? Where do they, especially if you're talking about Greenfield builds where they're plugging in thousands and thousands of cables, it just made really quick work to be able to spot exactly where they'd not plugged something in properly or what cable or transceiver was not working or anything like that. All right, finally, in my minute left here, Netbox. So an interesting thing about my deployment here actually was that because this was completely greenfield, my code was actually more of the source of truth here, right? I didn't need Netbox from day zero to build this out. My code essentially built up inventory, configs, everything. I was actually using Netbox as the common place for us to build everything else after the network. So this was the server hardware, VMs, applications, all of that. Essentially, I'd use my code to go and run an Ansible playbook, push essentially all of that inventory information into Netbox so that the other teams could effectively use Netbox to bootstrap their applications. What VM what application should I spin up on what VM, what IP addresses to use, all of that type of stuff I'd essentially pushed into Netbox. So not a typical deployment there from that standpoint. I wasn't using this for networking inventory. I was using this really to build up the applications. And then, so a few last final thoughts on this one, right? This is all hard, right? The reason we're all here in this room, right, is that network automation has some elements of it that are significantly more complex than just spinning up NGINX on a server, right? All of that state that we have to deal with and routing protocol propagation and everything just makes this inherently more difficult, right? Next point is start small. For those of you that are earlier on this one, probably one of the best lessons I can suggest on this, right, is you've got to show quick wins along the way if you're going to build momentum. Start small, possibly start read-only, do docs, gather inventory information, start with things that are instantly going to make people's lives easier. Show that value to the team around you, to your management, so that you can get those quick wins that they're going to keep on investing in those types of projects, right? I went in basically too hardcore. I didn't show incremental value along the way and ended up failing the first time around on trying to actually get my organization to switch over to doing automation. So learn from my failures. And then the last bit of this, right, community helps. That's the reason why I'm here, right? That's the reason, hopefully, that all of you are here, and hopefully this is now going to be more of a regular thing. So I'll wrap it up and basically say thanks from Mark, right, from Netbox Labs, for actually proposing this, putting this all together, because as we can just see here in this room, right, there's a tremendous desire for this to come back to life here, certainly around London. So hopefully I'll be able to see you guys at the next event. That's all for me. Thank you.
Pete, so Q&A.
Sorry?
You are leading by example here. You actually had another at least 8 minutes.
Oh,
So-
this is 9:30. Oh, my bad.
So we can do some Q&A if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Any questions for Pete? Rich is walking around with a mic so that we can get you on the recordings.
Yeah, just a quick one. Do you think if you hadn't had that bike crash, you would have been successful in deploying your networking in your data center?
I tested it out. I had theoretically a one-for-one simulation. I'm not going to go running around plugging vendors or anything like that. I will say from a network automation standpoint, one nice thing about Cumulus is that the VMs that you can deploy in a simulated environment work the same way and have all of the same underlying interface names and all of that type of stuff to make it easy to do a one-to-one simulation between what I wanted to build and what I could build, and theoretically had done all of that testing that my Ansible playbook should have taken a few minutes and I would have been done. But I'm sure that everyone in this room always thinks that the time that they run their playbook, everything's going to magically just work the first time, and it never does. But I'd done everything I could to try and make sure it was going to be the case.
Here we go, down the front.
So you didn't mention ChatGPT once, so 10 points for that. Good job, because it's legally required now for any technical talk, so really good job on that. Ooh. But on the Python versus, people going with the Python path when they go into Ansible and they go, oh no, I want to do this one little thing, I'll just write a Python script, right? What are your thoughts on pushing people toward making custom modules, when you need to do your own little build out? I mean, would you push them rather towards custom modules than you would to, hey, running a .py on a server somewhere? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So many thoughts.
We have time.
It's a trade-off of maintainability, right, and custom code, and can someone take it over? It's something relatively simple, right? One of the most frustrating things for me in Ansible is doing nested loops. Right,
it's not made
and
for
that's a
that.
case where it's like just abandon Ansible's way to do it, because you'll create more complexity in trying to troubleshoot it in Ansible than trying to understand this tiny few lines of Python that anybody could read very quickly and understand what it actually does. But ultimately, it's about maintainability for me, because someone else has to be able to step in.
Thanks.
One over here on the
Oh, one last
one
one.
here, and then one in the front. Yeah.
Yeah, just on the Ansible versus Python question, something that occurred to me because it's actually come up for me in the last couple of days at work, is Ansible's great for deploying stuff. What I've not found it so good at is doing things like going to this particular piece of information, comparing it to that particular piece of information in the source of truth. And just one obvious example is I was asked to compare prefixes that were in D42 versus what was in Netbox. I came to the conclusion the quickest way to do this was to write a diffsync, was to write a Python script based on diffsync. But then there was a little bit of pushback, why aren't you doing it in Ansible? I just wondered if you had any thoughts on doing Ansible and Python from the point of view of validating what's on the network as opposed to deploying the network.
Yeah, really good point, right? I was focused basically on at that point, because it was Greenfield, relatively rudimentary ways. It was also a static data center build, I would say, where I didn't have to worry about a lot of state change once it had actually been built. So I didn't actually have to do a lot of validation about what was the difference between the intended state of the network before you did the push and how is it actually working in reality, right? That's a great one that I would love someone around here to end up actually talking on their experiences around that. I've got a whole lot of thoughts and everything on it. Next one of these, please, someone share your experiences around on that. There's multiple different approaches there. Like you said, Ansible, it's a bit difficult to try and actually do that. How do I go and log into a box, get the BGP state, for example, and then end up doing a diff compared to what Netbox or an Autobot actually has inside of it. There are various open source tools around it. I won't mention any commercial tools around this given space at all. But yes, it is there. As you said, Ansible sucks at that. And so Python's usually what I ended up having to do that exact same thing. Agreed. But please, I'd also encourage here throughout the day, speak to each other on this. Don't just even speak to me. If you've got something to say around on this and share, please do speak up.
Yeah, fella.
Hi.
So you had some setbacks. How did you then go back in, when you eventually got out of hospital, back in and get the momentum going again for the next project kind of thing? You said people weren't overly, if they're happy firefighting it, you had to do so much work to get to the point and then it didn't quite work out how it expected. How did you then sort of go back in and say, that didn't work, but the next one's going to be great without, if you see what I mean?
Yes, I do. And as I was trying to talk about this, trying to figure out if there's anything I can share there on that, it depends. In my case, it was different project, different team that I gravitated towards because I knew that I was essentially never going to solve the firefighting mentality from where I stood in the organization. It was pointless, right? Unless it's solved at a much higher level, then it was kind of, it was never going to get there. So I gravitated towards something where I could succeed. Would be a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, we got one more question. Yeah.
So I was going to ask, if you had a fairly large team, would you hire a developer that had networking experience, or would you rather have the networking guys learn a bit of Python? What's your focus?
This goes back ultimately to what are the business goals, right? If you're talking about a little bit of automation to just go and do read-only type things, right? But when it ends up crossing on over into, we want to get to the point where people aren't logging into the command line of a device and we have to trust that our automation's actually working, right? And this is more than just config push, right? One of the big things on this, right, as we just talked about, is that network validation side of automation right? Network automation, if you just look at it from a config push standpoint, is a great way to break your network at scale, right? So unless you've actually solved the validation side of this, and when you start getting dangerously close to that, then your tooling matters, right? Your code coverage, your supportability, maintainability, all of the testing and validation on it, both in the code itself and from the network standpoint. And you can either get lucky and find a network engineer who's actually got a developer mindset and quickly learn, or get someone who's a full-time developer, pair them up. And so many times I've seen much better results from that standpoint. Much quicker and much higher quality results from it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, that's
All
what we
right,
have
I'm out of
for.
time.
Big
So-
round of applause for Pete again.
Perfect.